Okay. All right. So it's good to see everyone this morning. The portion this week is Teitzei, and it begins in the Eitz Chaim on page 1112. Page 1112. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So, just like a note of trivia about this portion. Just one second, somebody else is coming in. So our portion, Ki Teitzei, on page 1112, a note about just an element of trivia that of the 613 commandments that the rabbis derive from Torah law, they say 72 of them are from this week's portion. So the rabbis in the Talmud say that there are 613 commandments. It's the rabbis in the Middle Ages who list them. In other words, perhaps the rabbis of the Talmud came up with 613 just as a big number that is also related to how many words there are in the Shema and the 3 paragraphs that accompany the Shema in the morning and the evening service. So, in other words, the rabbis say that there are 248 positive commandments, and that's how many words there are in the Shema and the 3 paragraphs. And there are 365 negative commandments. That's how the rabbi, one way to divide up the commandments. But again, in the Talmud, they're not listed. They just come up with these numbers. They know that there's 365 days in the year, and they, according to them, the rabbis say that there are 248 parts of our body, or bones in our body, 248 bones in our body. So you have the positive commandments that equal 248, the negative commandments equal 365. But it's not until the rabbis of the early Middle Ages who came up with a list of what those 613 commandments are. And interestingly enough, those rabbis who list them, the lists are slightly different. So if you have a list, let's say from the Rambam, Maimonides, his list would be different than Nachmanides, Ramban, his list. So the point is that in a way, it doesn't really matter what exactly the 613 commandments are. And in a way, I'm not saying that it doesn't matter. Observing mitzvot doesn't matter. What I am saying is how many there are doesn't really matter, because there are more mitzvot that we do today. And there are also certain of those mitzvot that we can't do until the temple is rebuilt. A lot of the mitzvot have to do with the sacrifices and other offerings brought in a temple. So, to my point again, 72 commandments of the 613 are found in this week's portion, Ki Teitzei, and we'll look at some of them. We have talked about many of these laws over the years, and this is what came to my mind as I was reviewing the portion today. So I want to first look on page 1113. This we have talked about before, but you can't help but look at it and be be shocked by it, no matter how many times we read the portion and how many years we've been hearing it in shul. So verse 18 on the bottom of 1113, Ki yihiyeh leish ben sorer or umoreh. So if a person has a child, so I'm translating it in the egalitarian, gender-free. If I was very literal, I said if a man had a son who was, they translate sorer umoreh as wayward and defiant. Okay? So if a person has a wayward and defiant son or child, and what does wayward and defiant mean? Enenu shomea bekol aviv uvekol imo. He doesn't obey. He doesn't listen to. He doesn't follow directions from his father and his mother. Okay? So that's a wayward and defiant child, not listening, refusing to listen to his parents. So what should they do if a parent has such a child? V'yisru oto, v'yisru oto v'lo yishma aleihem, and they've tried to discipline him. So they have disciplined him, and he continues not to listen to them. Okay, so wayward and defiant means he's not listening to his parents. His parents try to discipline him, and the child refuses to obey. There is such in the mental health world today, especially related to school students, there is such a disorder known as a defiant child. And that is that a child, and it's understood in the mental health world, that the child cannot help the fact that he or she is defiant. There are psychological methods and there are some medications that a child can take that will help offset some of the defiant syndrome, but it is known as a psychological disorder for a child to be diagnosed as being defiant. So, okay, so, but I bring that up only because that certainly in the time of the Torah, definitely in the time of the rabbis, they really had no understanding of psychological disorders. They knew that people acted strangely or bizarrely, but they would credit it to being overtaken by God, or perhaps in some societies, a child has a devil or a demon inside of them. Okay, so it's only in very modern times that we have a slight understanding of the brain and disorders of the brain. And still, this is the one area of medicine that still poses a tremendous challenge. And it's reflected, in healthcare in our country, in that mental illness is not really covered by most health insurance plans. Psychotherapy, visits to a psychiatrist, these things are not really covered by health insurance. And it's a tragedy that people who do suffer from mental illness don't have, unless they're wealthy, don't have adequate resources in this country. Anyway, that long tangent just about a child refusing to listen to the discipline or to obey after being disciplined by his parents. That's the wayward, defiant child. So then what do you do with such a child? The Torah is teaching us. Verse 19, 11, 14. V'tafsu vo avi v'imo v'hotziu oto el ziknei iro ve'el sha'ar mekomo. So they should grab him, his parents should, and take him out to the elders of his city and to the gate of his place. So to have grab hold of this child, if you can, and take this child to where the elders of the city are, and that's at the city gates. And verse 20, Ve'amru el ziknei iro, benenu zeh sorer umoreh. And they say to the elders of his city, our child, quote, this, our child, benenu zeh, this child, our child, is wayward and defiant. Einenu shomea bekolenu, he doesn't listen to us, or we could say he refuses to listen to us. Zolel v'soveh. So they're adding two more adjectives that the Torah hasn't had yet. So the Torah describes a child as wayward and defiant. The parents are defining the child as wayward and defiant, and zolel v'soveh, which is translated as glutton and drunkard. Okay, so for the parents, defiant and wayward is based on being a glutton and a drunkard. But the Torah doesn't add that, the parents do. Does that have any impact on this? I'll explain in a moment. And then what happens? Ur gamuhu kol anshe iro ba'avanim vamet uviarta hara mikirbecha v'chol Yisrael yishma'u v'yira'u. So all the people of the city should stone him with stones till he dies. So such a child who's brought by his parents as a wayward and defiant child, the elders of the city listen. The parents add two more conditions, that he's a glutton and a drunkard. And then the decision is that the inhabitants of the city, not the elders of the city, but the inhabitants of the city stone this child to death. Why? So that the evil should be eradicated from your midst. And all of Israel should listen and see. In other words, they should learn their lesson from the example of this child and what's done to this child. Now, based on what we've been reading so far in the book of Deuteronomy, this isn't an unusual punishment. We've seen punishments like this before, but they're related to idolatry and false prophecy, especially if the false prophecy is to entice people to become pagan. So it's about idolatry and pagan practice. We'll see also in this portion and other portions about witchcraft, laws against witchcraft and the like, and also how to deal with the inhabitants of the land of Israel once the Israelites start settling the land, that they're supposed to totally annihilate the indigenous population. So brutality like this is not unusual. Okay, so in other words, what I'm saying is we shouldn't be shocked by the nature of the punishment, because we've seen this punishment described already many times throughout the book of Deuteronomy. What should be shocking is that this is a law, that this punishment applies to our own child. Now, so in other words, parents, I'd say most parents would love their child no matter what kind of child their child is, right? Their child, so you imagine Adolf Hitler's parents. Adolf Hitler's parents could be disgusted with the kind of person Adolf Hitler became. But most parents, if Adolf Hitler were their child, would be disgusted and might not want to have anything to do with their child anymore. But you might say that there's an inherent love that they might have for their child. And even parents whose child is an Adolf Hitler might not want to bring such a child to the court in order to have their child stoned to death. Now, Adolf Hitler's parents might agree that Adolf Hitler should be captured and brought to trial and executed. Parents might not get in the way of that, and they could mourn the day, mourn the fact that their child became such a child. What I'm thinking of also is there's an extremely long novel that came out a number of years ago about the Columbine school shooting in Colorado a number of years ago. And I forget the name of the novel, but the novel was about the parents of the student who shot up the school. And there have been other novels about parents of children who become such serial murderers or murdering, going to school and shooting up a school. So tragically, in America, there are a variety and a huge number of school shootings that could be the basis for such literature. So what's clear in the novels that I have read about in cases like this is the love. Now, the disgust comes through, and the chest beating comes through, like, where did I go wrong? But still, the idea that a parent would turn their child over to the authorities, that I don't think would happen. That's one thing about the Torah portion that it should stand out. The idea that the parents could be such objective bystanders to this case and treat their child as if the child is not their own, and that it's somebody else that they're bringing to court. Okay, so the rabbis, of course, had a lot to say about this law, and I know that I've talked about it before, but it bears repeating and understanding exactly who we are as Jews today vis-a-vis the Torah. So I can't emphasize enough that we are not what are so-called Torah true Jews. And even those in the Jewish community who claim to be Torah true Jews are not Torah true Jews. Torah true Jews are Karaites. Okay, and I would even argue the Sadducees from 2,000 years ago, known in Hebrew as the Tzedukim, mainly the Kohanim and the community who offered sacrifices in the temple, those were Torah true Jews. They, the Tzedukim, the Sadducees, and the Karaites believed that the Torah is the only text that matters to understand what we as Jews need to do today. And that how dare the rabbis come along and say that not only should the Torah be interpreted to derive more law, and not only should the rabbis interpret the laws as to what they mean and how we could understand them differently, but how dare the rabbis to take authority upon themselves to have this approach to studying Torah. So 2,000 years ago, there's a great debate in the community in Israel as to whether the rabbis had the right to do this, and the average Jew in Israel unsure who to follow. Should they follow the rabbis? Should they follow the Sadducees, or just not, or just make up their minds any other way? The destruction of the temple ended the debate because the Sadducees then had no foundation anymore for their worship of God. As the Torah says, you can't can't bring sacrifices if the temple doesn't stand. So it's because of the destruction of the temple that we, as Jews today, follow in the rabbinic tradition. Okay, and so I also can't emphasize enough that the rabbis derived this methodology out of a way of bringing the Torah to life. They didn't want to create something out of whole cloth. They're not creating something brand new. It's not a new form of religion. It's just a way of saying the Torah is so important and as God's word that it should be followed all the time. It shouldn't just be read for the laws that are written right here in the book, but we should expand upon them because it's meant to be a guideline for everything we do in life every single day, every moment of the day. And the Torah, just read literally, doesn't legislate for every moment of the day. The rabbis added that for us. So, for the rabbis then, what they also allow is a sense of understanding law, and they only do this sometimes, they don't do it all the time, understanding law in its context, and that sometimes the laws of the Torah cannot be followed anymore. And that's what they say about this very law. Now they don't, so they do say that, so they add conditions to interpreting this law to make it so that it's almost nearly impossible to be able to be enacted. And even if it could then be enacted, they say, no, it never was and never will be. And that it's just meant to be studied, not to be practiced. So I've said this before, in Talmud class years ago, we studied the section in the Talmud that talked about this very law, and it was several pages of discussion and to define the age of the child. That's the first thing. The Torah doesn't tell us how old this child has to be. It just says son. A father brings his son, and then really it's about the parents bringing their son. So the son, what's the age of the son? So that for the rabbis, the age of the son is between 12 years and 1 day and 12 years, 6 months and a day. So that 6-month time period in the 12th year of the child is when this could happen. Not any time before, not any time after. A child could be defiant and wayward before they're 12 and 1 day, and after they're 12 and 6 months and a day. And then that you couldn't apply this law to that. So if you have that 6-month time period, then that's number one. Number two, both parents have to bring the child, and they have to agree that they're bringing the child, and the child has to be defiant of both of them. So in other words, the child can't just disobey dad and listen to mom, or vice versa. If that's the case, you can't bring the child. Okay, and both parents, so he's defiant of both parents, and both parents have to bring the child, and because it adds glutton and a glutton and a drunkard, the Talmud defines glutton over what? A particular kind of meat. And if it's anything else, it doesn't matter. It has to be that kind of meat. And they say some Italian cut of meat. And, or maybe it's the drunkard is about a certain kind of wine. So maybe it's an Italian wine. I don't remember exactly, but it has to be a particular kind of meat that he's a glutton for, and a particular kind of wine that he becomes a drunk over. Okay, so with all of that, the rabbis give themselves the authority to interpret this to the point where it's impossible to follow. And this isn't the only case, but this is the most extreme example of it. in the Torah. Because we've talked about before an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and how the rabbis say right away that that is not physical punishment. We're not learning literal punishment, but it's monetary punishment. It's how much the eye or the tooth that gets damaged or ruined, how much that's worth. So in other words, I gouge out somebody else's eye, that person doesn't have the right to gouge out my eye. The person has the right to claim monetary damages for the value of his eye that I damaged. Okay, so the rabbis give themselves the authority to interpret the Torah in this way. So we have to always keep in mind that when we're reading the Torah, we can read the Torah through a variety of lenses. We can read the Torah just in our own way. So we bring whatever we bring to reading literature with whatever knowledge we're bringing to it. And we apply, because we're all brought up in Western society, we bring Western values to what we read. But we're also Jewish. So we bring in our own way, to the level of knowledge that we have, we bring Jewish values to what we read as well. And the rabbis would have us really, the best way to read the text is through their lens, right? So that when we read the Torah, their lens is teaching the story that we're supposed to derive from the text. So if we're reading about Abraham and Sarah, then we have to read it through the story that the rabbis come up about Abraham and Sarah. And those are the stories that we always have to keep in mind. It might be okay for us to come up with other stories, but for the rabbis, the best stories are the ones that they derive. And that's the lessons that they want to keep on being carried on from one generation to the next. But then there's also the law that can be derived from the particular verse. So a story about Abraham and Sarah is not teaching us law, except for the section in which God commands Abraham to circumcise his son at 8 days, and that to be carried on from one father to son in perpetuity. So that's a law. But everything else about Abraham and Sarah are just stories that the rabbis add their interpretations to. And then when it comes to law, the rabbis do the same thing. This is how we understand the law. So you might understand it differently. So, for example, when it comes to homosexuality, a man should not lie with a man in the manner of lying with a woman. It's an abomination. Okay, so that seems pretty clear and unambiguous. But there could be ways to interpret that to allow for homosexual relationship. And it could also allow for forbidding a homosexual relationship. So the rabbis, their lens for centuries was to read it as if it's forbidding homosexual relationship. It's not until the conservative movement and scholars of the conservative movement found other ways to read it that would allow for homosexual relationships. And the way the conservative movement scholars read it was through the guidelines of the rabbis themselves. In other words, if we're going to continue the process of interpreting Torah to derive law, we should do it through the parameters of prior generations of rabbis and how they interpret the law. So we agree as rabbinic Jews that we will maintain the system based on the parameters and guidelines that the rabbis themselves provided, which still provides a wide range of interpretation that is available to us. So the Torah says the rabbis say pretty clearly that we're not supposed to mix meat and milk. it's not so self-evident in the Torah that we're not supposed to do that. It says in the Torah, do not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. But the rabbis use that to teach we're not supposed to have a cheeseburger. Okay? So, okay, whether they're right and wrong or wrong about how they interpret that verse, that's just the law that the rabbis came up with. And if any rabbi were to teach today that cheeseburgers are kosher, and I mean actual cheese, cow's milk, goat milk, sheep milk cheese, not plant-based cheese, okay? So the plant-based cheese would be in air quotes. All right, so real cheese from an animal, milk from an animal, cheeseburgers will never be kosher. And any rabbi who claims that mixing meat and milk should be kosher, it just should be written out of the rabbinic system. If you claim to be part of the rabbinic system, then you have to play by the rules of the rabbinic system. If you claim you're not part of the rabbinic system, then you can do whatever you want. So, for example, Reform Jews say that halacha is not important anymore. Jewish law is not important. It's a value. There's a tradition there, but it doesn't have veto over our behavior. Ethical and moral principles are what's important for Reform Jews. Okay, so they step out of the rabbinic system of Jewish law and derive principles and practices that are different in the Reform movement than they are in conservative or Orthodox Judaism, which are within the system denominations of Judaism. So when in the Reform movement says a father or a mother, a mother or a father, because mother is the tradition, a mother or a father can determine the religion of the child. That is stepping out of the system, because the system says it's only the mother who defines the religion of the child. So if a Jewish man is married to a non-Jewish woman and they create biological children themselves, their biological children are not Jewish because the mother is not Jewish. In the Reform movement, the child is Jewish as long as the family agrees that the religion in their family is Judaism. So a Reform movement creates new law or new practice, new understanding of ethics and morality. In the conservative movement, there hasn't been a moral position to say that the definition of who is a Jew, being only the mother, is immoral. Or we haven't had a position to say that eating cheeseburgers is a moral right of all human beings. So that law of mixing meat and milk hasn't risen to the point where it's questioning our morality. And the law of mother determining the religion of the child hasn't risen to a level of morality yet. There are conversations about interfaith marriages within the conservative movement and whether we should be proposing that mother or father can determine the religion of the child. So there's rumblings about it, but there are no rumblings at all about mixing meat and milk. That hasn't risen to a moral level. What has is whether we should be carnivores or not. Okay, so the idea that we should be vegetarian, that is a conversation of morality. But nobody has said that Jews should only be vegetarian. Some have stated that that's the ideal, but nobody has said that people who are not vegetarian are immoral or unethical people. Nobody has said that. So it's just a lengthy tangent that I just want to emphasize about reading this law, that it's imperative for us to keep in mind that as Jews today, we do not read the Torah literally, okay? And that anybody who argues that they are Torah true Jews are false. They're creating, it's like some politicians today or anybody on social media who wants to prove that their narrative is the right one and everybody else is wrong. They use sound bites to try to teach their lesson. So the sound bite of "we are Torah true Jews" is just false. It's false advertising. Because all Orthodox, no matter what branch of Orthodox they are, all Orthodox and all conservative Jews follow Rabbinic Judaism. And Rabbinic Judaism is not Torah true, meaning they're not literal readers of the Torah. They all base themselves on interpretation of the Torah. Just look at the ultra-Orthodox. Why do they wear white shirt, black pants, and the coats the way they do? Not because the Torah says it. The Torah doesn't say that. And they do that because that's the custom that has been handed down for 300 years in their Hasidic dynasty. So they're not Torah true. There are things that they do, that the fact that they light candles on Shabbos is the fact that it's not, that we are not Torah true. Because nowhere in the Torah does it say to light candles to usher in the Shabbat. Nowhere in the Torah. Okay, now, the rabbis understand that they derive it from the Torah, but it's not the Torah. It's not in the Torah. Okay, so enough said about all of that. Any thoughts or comments about that? And then we'll look at something else. Okay, so these 72 laws that are listed here in our, yes, go ahead, Sumner.
You mentioned something about restricting this reference of it, this story
Yes.
of a defined child to those between 12 and 6 months.
Right.
I was wondering, is there any rationale for that?
No. No, I mean, it was random. The rabbis try to understand the word ben, son. How old would this child be? So that I guess their understanding is that child has to be old enough to understand that they're being defiant. You know, it's one thing for a 2-year-old to be defiant, but that's what 2-year-olds do. They always say no. It's just part of child development. And they're not really understanding that they're saying no. It's just what they do. So there comes a time that then a child learns right and wrong, and understanding that you have to listen to authority for your own good. So children do, most children learn that. The children who don't learn that either become these defiant children or become psychopaths. Okay.
So what if a child is 14 and he's
right? Then it doesn't count. This law doesn't apply. The law was strictly applied to that 6-month time period in a way to ensure that this law would not ever be practiced.
Okay.
Okay. So that's clear from the Talmud that the rabbis, they end up saying it at the end of the conversation in the Talmud about all the restrictions that they add. But adding the restriction, it's like the same thing with the Torah tells us you're supposed to execute a murderer. And we're also told in the Torah you need 2 witnesses to convict someone of a crime. Okay, so the rabbis were not enamored with executing murderers. They didn't think. They took their job seriously, and the idea of spilling blood is a very serious matter. So they added restrictions to that too. How do you convict a murderer of their capital crime and then execute them? What would be the conditions that need to apply? Well, the two witnesses need to be there, and the two witnesses need to warn the murderer that what the murderer is about to do would be considered murder. Okay, so imagine the scenario then. So if you have two witnesses who have the wherewithal to tell the potential murderer, hey, stop what you're doing, would the murderer then stop what they're doing? Or would the murderer continue to murder? So imagine if someone, conspiracy theories aside, imagine that somebody was in the Dallas Book Depository in November of 1963. Two people were in the room with Lee Harvey Oswald. And the two people told Lee Harvey Oswald, you know what you're about to do? No, so they understood that he was about to shoot John F. Kennedy. So imagine two people in the room telling Lee Harvey Oswald, you know what you're about to do would be considered murder. And you know what else would have to happen? A murderer would have to acknowledge hearing the warning. Yes, I understand that what I'm about to do would be considered murder. So you're supposed to have this legal conversation in order for then if Lee Harvey Oswald still did what he did, after warning from two witnesses and saying and acknowledging the warning, and he still murdered John F. Kennedy, then he would be fit for being executed by the court. Okay, so again, they come up with this, the rabbis come up with a scenario that would be almost impossible to come about, and therefore makes it impossible for a rabbinic court to execute someone of their capital crime. Okay, so so these two examples of murder and the defiant child, and the way the rabbis go about discussing it and coming up with all the conditions is a way for us to understand what the rabbinic system is, their legal judicial philosophy is. The dean of my rabbinical school, when I entered, when I applied to rabbinical school, when I started rabbinical school, he was no longer the dean, but he was still a Talmud professor, Rabbi Joel Roth. So many rabbis of my generation and older are very much influenced by Rabbi Joel Roth. He wrote an incredibly academic analysis of Jewish law. The halachic process, a systemic analysis. That's Rabbi Joel Roth's book. It was his lifetime. It's like his magnum opus. And the problem is you have to be a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. You have to be like a professor of law to understand what Joel Roth was teaching. And so in his book, he analyzes the whole thing about what the rabbinic mindset is and what their approach is. But for the layman, it's clear that that what the rabbis are doing is trying to add their understanding of Jewish values to the Torah. It might not necessarily be the Jewish values that are in the Torah, but the values that we understand that are in the Torah are rabbinic values. So the idea that we shouldn't that we should be very, very careful about spilling blood is a rabbinic idea. It's not clear in the Torah. The Torah is pretty clear that that people should be executed for major and for minor crimes. And even last week, when we read about the city that would be the Jewish city that would become an idolatrous city, clear that in the Torah that city should be destroyed, totally, the population totally annihilated. The rabbi said also about that never was, never will be. So the rabbis dare to take the values that seem pretty clear from the Torah and to adjust them and to teach them in a way that because it's been 2,000 years already, we understand it now as to be Jewish values. So when we read, the more knowledgeable we are of rabbinic methodology and rabbinic teaching, the more that we have that ingrained into how we read the Torah, then when we read the Torah, it becomes also a shock to us because we're reading the Torah through a rabbinic lens, and then we read this law about the defiant child. But wait a second, the rabbi said this never was, never will be. So to see it in the Torah is shocking because the rabbi said never was, never will be, right? So how we read the Torah again today through the lens that we're wearing and reading it through could make the Torah kind of shocking to us. But again, for us, and this is in contrast to how Muslims read their sacred text, how certain Christians read their sacred text, right? Because this idea that we have a 2,000-year tradition of interpreting the text and deriving new meaning and new law is really hard for some Christians and many Muslims to accept because it's just not their way of reading their sacred text. So the nicer ones in interfaith dialogue would say, that's very interesting. But the not so nice ones would say, you're a heretic. How can you read? What kind of religion is it that takes liberty with sacred text, that God-given text? We don't do that to our text. How dare you do it to your text? So it makes for fascinating, if not difficult, interfaith dialogue. Okay, so actually it's 11:47, and the other things I wanted to bring up would require more than 10 minutes to discuss them. So any other thoughts or comments about this? Sometimes I feel like I'm beating a dead horse because I've mentioned this so many times, but it's just I think it's important for me to be reminded of this, and I think it's important for us to remember this too, that we should not look down upon our tradition when we understand that our tradition is not taking the Bible literally. It's still what the rabbis are trying to do is still trying to understand God's word, and through we understand God's word through practice and through study. And the mystics even took it further, study to the point where you're in a trance and rising above this world and entering God's world. So study and practice are supposed to lead us to a better understanding of what exactly God was trying to teach us in the Torah.
If I understand it right,
Yes.
it sounds like before the destruction of the temple, there were several movements within Judaism, just like
Yes.
you might say there are movements within Judaism
Yes.
today.
Yes.
But with the destruction, the rabbinic tradition is the one that became
Correct.
dominant.
By default, because the Torah the Sadducees had no basis for doing their practice anymore. Everything about their understanding of Judaism was bringing sacrifices and offerings to the temple in Jerusalem.
Right.
Temple not there, you can't come up with an alternative place.
Yeah.
Because even they agreed it can only be done in the temple in Jerusalem.
So there would be no Judaism today.
If we were Sadducees only, there would be no Judaism today. That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yes. Okay, have a good rest of the day, everybody. It's good to see everyone, and we'll see you again next Wednesday for more Torah study.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.